Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us during this opportunity to speak with three women who have been working in the field of sustainable finance for decades. The three women we have with us today are well versed in the complexities of the Net Zero Alliance and whether or not countries can actually accomplish it. Today, these women will be walking us through the implications of the Net Zero Alliance and whether technology and policy discussions can help in addressing certain implementation challenges. The first panelist we have with us today is Ms. Rebecca Perlman, a corporate lawyer at leading international law firm Herbert Smith Freehills. There, she leads the firm's global impact investment and social finance practice and its ESG, sustainability, and responsible business practice in the UK, US, and EMEA. Ms. Perlman specializes in advising public, private, and third sector clients on domestic and international impact investment transactions and on ESG matters more broadly, including in relation to risk management, market disclosure, as well as mission led structures such as B Corps. She has been recognized in the Lawyer's Hot 100 for her work on ESG matters and in the NatWest's Wise 100 list of the UK's most influential women in impact investment. She is the chair of the Big Issue Invest Trust and a trustee of the UN Refugee Agency's UK charity. Today, she will be speaking with us about the Net Zero Alliance and sustainability within law alongside our next two panelists. The second panelist we have with us today is Ms. Lynn Johansson, who is Canada's lead negotiator on ISO 14100 on green finance. She is a seasoned veteran of the international standards development community. She is also a key negotiator for Canada for the ISO 14001, the international standard for environmental management systems. She was the chair of the minor committee to ISO/TC 207 from 2016 to 2019. To top it all off, she has led the international review on environmental aspects, impacts, and significance for ISO 14004. Today, she will be speaking with us about her experience and her thoughts regarding the Net Zero Alliance. The third leader we have with us on the panel is Dr. Nisha Kohli, who is an impact leader in sustainability, startups, and entrepreneurship with over 20 years of experience in consulting, training, managing finance functions in multinational and private organizations. She defines success as the ability of a company to transition from lacking sustainability and governance to reporting ethically and transparently. Moreover, she finds success in mentoring and advising startups to grow and formulate a solid web of connections. Prior to settling in Singapore to establish Nishvan Consulting, she had the privilege of traveling across the world and living in different countries where she was fortunate to advise senior executives, directors, and corporates through Nishvan Consulting. The motto of her life and company, Nishvan Consulting, is Elevate Your Potential. Nishvan has spread its wings with channel partners across many countries. To further her creativity and imagination, she loves exploring and researching various business topics. She was awarded the Corporate Governance Research Scholar Award in 2008 from the International Corporate Governance Network for her outstanding research in the field of corporate governance. Since 2008, she has published a number of corporate governance case studies and research articles in internationally renowned journals such as the Journal of Disclosure and Governance, HBSP Richard Ivey, Cambridge, and more. To create a larger impact, she has created a sustainability platform which is AI-enabled called CorpStage. Today, we will hear more about the capabilities of CorpStage. She will join Ms. Perlman and Ms. Johansson to speak about the Net Zero Alliance, more about ESGs and sustainability within finance. Please join me in welcoming all three of our panelists, Ms. Rebecca Perlman, Ms. Lynn Johansson, and Dr. Nisha Kohli. Thank you.
Thank you, Suhana, for your warm introduction. I welcome Lynn and Rebecca on this platform with Nishvan and CorpStage and even like Women Entrepreneurship Days organization. I'm representing Asia for Vido here. So welcome you both. Let me first, start. I'll be moderating the session. So let me start with the introduction on the topic. To save our planet from catastrophic climate change, we need to limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Today, we are already at 1.1 and are seeing storms, floods, and wildfires intensifying around the world. Air pollution sadly affects the health of tens of millions of people and unpredictable weather causes untold damages to homes and even livelihoods that we have seen during COVID 19. Globally, communities and governments have entered into Paris Agreement, but climate risks are unstoppable and we have to do something about it. While the impacts of climate change are devastating, advances in tackling it can lead to cleaner air, creating good jobs, restoring nature, and at the same time unleashing economic growth. Who do you think can bring changes? Who is responsible for contributing and leading action efforts? Let's take an opinion poll from the audience. Can the audience see? Um, so we have 30 seconds for the poll, 10 more seconds left. Thank you. So people say that companies are responsible. 50% of the people say companies are responsible, and 30% of the people say individuals and communities, and 20% believe that governments are responsible. Let me share the results with you. Okay, great. Okay. So, collectively, actually, if you really ask me, we all are responsible for our impact on the planet. And it is vital that as a global community, we move urgently beyond low carbon or no carbon. Companies and governments of more than 60 countries have already signed net zero alliance decarbonization commitments and to reduce their carbon emission levels to zero in the coming years. While there is a lot of buzz around the alliance and pledges, the implementation will not be free from challenges. The real challenge will be to achieve the targets set out in the commitments. There will be significant implications for investors, companies, as well as policymakers. There'll be overwhelming and costly disruptions taking place in the near future. The question is whether technology and policy decisions can help in addressing these challenges. What role can sustainable finance and corporates play in accomplishing these net zero goals? I have another poll for you. That do you think that these targets are deliverable? So, do you believe that these targets are deliverable? People have different views on that. We have been reading articles every day and discussing those. Okay, 5 more seconds to go. Okay, thank you. So let me share the results with you. People believe, only 17% believe that these goals are deliverable, and 17% believe they are not. However, partially they feel 67%. That means yes or no. So we are not sure about that. Yes, that's what we are going to discuss here today, how we can move towards this direction. So, our first session is about corporates. My questions will be to Lynn for that. So, strategic objectives are not achievable unless we identify risk. And that's like a normal, when we plan, we say strategies can be achieved only when we identify risk and we monitor those and manage those. But climate risk is an emergent risk and it's inevitable. We all have to face it, whether or not we take advantage of the opportunity. So it presents a chance for the business to lead the way and build a reputation for taking effective action. So the corporates who take the action, actually they can build reputation. So if corporates take these actions, not only reputation, they can also improve efficiency, reduce cost, drive innovation to achieve success. I read somewhere business as usual means no business at all in future. So we have to change. We have to bring radical changes to the business. We are honored to have Lynn Johansson with us today, who's president of E2M and CEO of the collaboration. I would like to ask her whether corporates see opportunities in reducing climate risk. Why should companies commit to net zero? Does net zero makes commercial sense for companies? Over to you, Lynn.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm going to see if I can share my screen.
Yeah, you can.
No, apparently not. So
Uh,
let's not worry about it.
it does. Please try. Yeah, it does.
Oh, here we go.
Okay.
Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Good. All right. Well, those are excellent questions. And in a perfect world, I would have brought two other people with me today. One would have been Mark Carney, because people probably know him better than they know me. And if Mark was to respond to that, he would have said that it's the power of money that will ultimately play the biggest role in combating climate change. Because he also feels that companies that don't adapt will go bankrupt without question. The other person I would have brought with me would be Mother Nature as the president of the Whole Earth Corporation. And she would be quite adamant in her views. Anyhow, so you get me instead today. So companies that really don't embrace this challenge and this opportunity, I think will face far bigger challenges than just going bankrupt. We know that from history, when you undermine the ecology, you also undermine society, and you will have financial chaos that follows. Now, we've never had a global financial collapse before. We've had crises before. But if we don't figure this out, it's essentially like putting ourselves out in a plank and walking the plank. And of course, instead of having water underneath us, we will have drought. And that will be a hard hit, which we would like to avoid. But we also see there's going to be a much widening gap between, as we saw with COVID, you'll see a very widening gap between those that have and those that don't have. And that's not going to be too helpful. So let's come back to the concept of net zero. Well, if we think about that net zero, we actually don't have really a consistent definition around the world, but I'm going to err on using the one from the International Panel on Climate Change. So net zero is a pledge. It's a commitment that you make to reducing the human created emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, but they have to be balanced by what you remove. So think of it as a bathtub. So whatever flow of water you put in, you're going to have to take out. But we have to be careful about that, because we also have a bathtub right now, which is not level. And the problem is we are trying to prevent the previous water, i.e. the greenhouse gas emissions that have been trapped in things like permafrost. We want to keep that in the ground, but we also have to remove the stuff that we are creating every day. And right now we're still on a platform to go forward. So that has to change. So the other thing we found is that there's a report by the Energy and Climate Group that found that jurisdictions with net zero, they represent 61% of the GHG emissions and 68% of GDP and 56% of the population. And if that's accurate, that would be great. But I don't think that captures the whole story. There's also a tendency in the sustainable finance world that we look at financed emissions. But these aren't the only emissions that we have to be concerned about. We have to be concerned with everybody's emissions and how do we accurately capture those things. So if we come back to financed emissions, there are some emerging regulatory restrictions that are coming out on that. There's some social shifts that are going on. There's technology advances. But these really come down to which of these things are going to have a material risk on corporations. Because those material risks, which historically, when you looked at materiality from an accounting perspective, it really was about the dollars, and it wasn't on non-financial issues. But that whole scenario is now shifting, and there are international standards that are coming out that are supposed to be addressing those things. But these materiality issues that are non-financial can have substantial impact on a company's asset base. It can have a great impact on its credit worthiness. We also know that there's a lot of discussion going on right now about if credit ratings are really have their story appropriate. And I know the IASCO, the International Organization for Standardization of Securities Commissioners, they're going to try to create consistency in that area. But what is really materiality? And I'm going to pull from a standard that's in development. And this diagram was actually largely created by a gentleman, Kim Shoemaker, and maybe Kim's on today. But Kim was one of the people that worked with me on the standard 14,100, and we hope to have it out by the end of this year. And we really looked at materiality issue from the perspective is how does it relate back to environmental impacts and the context. So in an accounting perspective, materiality is very important because it relates to essential information for decision making. And that reflects on the organization, whether it does accurate reporting of what it has or does. And the concept of materiality from the accounting profession, of course, it really functions historically as a filter. And so the organizations come down this way. And it really now is being changed. And in Europe, there's pressure to have double materiality considered. But when you're making these materiality judgments, organizations have to consider the range of facts and circumstances. And now there is push towards bringing the environmental base in to that. But if these materiality assessments upon which the flow of capital is dependent, if these aren't accurate, and that includes this concept of pledging or committing to net zero, if these things aren't accurate, it will jeopardize trust. And trust is the currency that underlines the international marketplace. So that's going to cause us a lot of problems. So we need to make sure that trust can be reinforced so that investors, governments, and citizens have faith in the company that they're doing what they're saying in. Because if they don't, unfortunately, that leads us to this thing called greenwash. And going down that slope is a very slippery one. But there are other issues that we want to come back to in terms of these things. We have to understand when we are looking at this from the ground up, per se, which is where the environmental management people, I'm one of them, look at. We want to know, what does the company really understand what it is they have or do, what the consequences of the products and services that they create, what is the impact that they have, and the impact is the change to the environment. From there, which of these things are really significant? How does that affect materiality? And how does that affect things like financing? There are positive and negative impacts that can occur. There is a tendency, unfortunately, to focus on the negative, but I think if we can turn people around to understand the need to really understand how nature works and how to put that into the equation, I think that will be a very important factor. Anyhow, I hope that answers the first question. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Of course, setting a target is one thing, but and determining the materiality is very, very important. But then we have to also consider how the corporates are going to meet the targets. And it's essential from the outset to calculate. First thing, even before the implementation, it's important for the corporates to calculate the total greenhouse gas emissions, where there is a lot of confusions around. Of course, there are tools like science-based tools and GHG protocols. It depends which tool the corporates use. But given those tools, what do you think? Is there an overlap or link between these tools? For example, net zero target and SBTs. Can these tools help in achieving the targets?
I'll come back and share my screen again. The net zero is still a pledge, and organizations have to set targets that have meaningful deadlines. There has to be a mechanism to measure whether or not they're doing what they say they're doing. There was a lot of discussion, even this morning came out, another report that said there is a difference between what people or what corporations are reporting and what they're really doing. And so that gap forms a problem for us. Part of that problem, too, is that there is not sufficient knowledge in my mind in corporations, in governments, in communities, that they have to start from the ground first, because all our wealth is based on what we get from the ground, what we get from nature. So if we don't start with the bottom up, if we don't understand that, we will not be able to get a good read on what is material. And one of the things we also put in the standard was that materiality is a function of what is significant, which has to be assessed on your individual organization and the context you find yourself in. One of the values of things like the sustainable or the science-based targets is it's a sort of a community build on what they think things are. There's value in coming together on this because if you can collaborate on understanding what your individual organization, what your business sector targets should be, that can help elevate it. Things like, we'll reduce it for 10% by 2050. I'm sorry, that's just not even on the right planet. So we have to understand this relationship of what is material, what is significant, and what the context is. And we have to put it in the context of, if we're going to meet this Paris Agreement of getting ourselves down 1.5, we have to understand too that climate change, as critical a factor as it is, and we've been able in some ways to put a dollar value to that, climate change is not the most critical issue we're actually facing. The Stockholm Resilience Center has put together what they call their boundary conditions. And they have identified the fact that the loss of biodiversity, things like the biogeochemical flows affecting nitrogen and phosphorus, we're at far more risk from those. But there is a relationship between those physical things and climate change. The issue is, for climate change, is it's rapidly growing, and the things that we do today have a delay factor. So even though we've had 2 years of the pandemic, and we've had, I think most people around the world will recognize that we've had some pretty weird weather. Some of it's been very nice, some of it hasn't been very nice. In British Columbia, which is on the far side of Canada from me, there was this little town called Lytton, and Lytton had a heat dome, and their temperatures went to 121.3 degrees Celsius. And there was unfortunately a outburst of fires, and they no longer have a town. So science-based targets can be helpful as a community or collective, but you still have to do your homework first of all to understand how that's going to affect you. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for that. Often people are actually confused about the terminology associated with these climate actions and climate, targets, crisis, and so on. So there are terms like carbon removals, carbon reduction, neutrality, which we need to understand. As you are aware, we have with us Rebecca Pullman, who is regional head for almost half of the world on ESG and sustainability in the law firm Herbert Smith Freehills. I would like to ask her about the differentiation between carbon neutrality and net zero, and what role does carbon neutrality play in achieving net zero. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Nisha. I think what's interesting here, as you've mentioned, is that despite the fact that these two concepts represent distinct approaches to combating climate change, they are often incorrectly used interchangeably. So thinking about what they actually mean in practice, I think it's helpful first just to take a step back and set the scene with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which establishes a framework for measuring and managing greenhouse gas emissions from private and public sector entities. And that's across their operations, value chains, and mitigation actions. So the protocol has produced the world's most widely used greenhouse gas accounting standard, and that sets out 3 scopes of emissions. So first, you've got Scope 1 emissions, and those are direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions from the generation of purchased energy. So think about your supply chain. Scope 3 emissions are all indirect emissions that aren't included in Scope 2. So we're talking about those that occur in the wider value chain of a company, both upstream and downstream emissions. So then thinking sort of more directly about your question, what is the distinction between being carbon neutral and being net zero? Well, carbon neutral really means, and this is sort of pulling on some of the points that Lynn mentioned earlier, balancing the emissions that an entity produces by offsetting or sequestering the same amount of carbon that has been produced by the entity, or by buying enough carbon credits to make up the difference. So to be carbon neutral, a business needs to offset the carbon they directly emit into the atmosphere, and they need to look at the energy they're using and the emissions associated with that power generation. In other words, achieving carbon neutral status covers scopes 1 and 2. And a whole market has developed around carbon neutrality, enabling businesses to buy carbon credits where they invest in projects that will avoid, reduce, or capture carbon. So renewable energies, forest protection, that sort of thing. Achieving net zero emissions goes one step further, and it really refers to the overall balance of greenhouse gas emissions produced and those taken out of the atmosphere. So thinking about Lynn's bath. It covers scopes 1, 2, and 3. And so it is therefore much more challenging to achieve net zero than it is to achieve carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality doesn't really imply a commitment to reduce overall emissions. A carbon neutral business instead just needs to offset the emissions that it produces, even if those emissions are increasing. In contrast, a commitment to net zero means reducing emissions, with the goal of balancing out the amount of emitted greenhouse gases by an equal amount of greenhouse gas removals. So in other words, net zero means the maximum reduction of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions generated, and the offsetting of residual emissions through specific greenhouse gas removal initiatives. If we just take sort of a very simplified example then, the case of air travel. So if in total people within a given business take 100 flights per year, the organization could achieve carbon neutrality for those 100 flights by buying enough carbon credits or by supporting renewable energy projects to offset the emissions, or a combination of the two. To achieve net zero, however, the company would need to actually reduce the number of flights per year while also investing in projects that remove from the atmosphere the emissions produced by any remaining air travel.
Wow, that was a great explanation. Thank you so much for that. I have another question for you, but yeah, so let's. Fatih Barol, Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, he said that their roadmap shows the priority actions that are needed today to ensure the opportunity of net zero emissions by 2050. Narrow, but still achievable. And it's not lost. Everything is not lost yet. but we need to scale and speed the efforts, and they are critical goals. So we have to achieve that. The greatest challenge that we are facing today is this: the climate, the global warming, to be kept below 1.5 degrees centigrade. So, Rebecca, in your opinion, what are the pathways of achieving net zero commitments made by countries?
So that it is not an easy topic to cover briefly. I'll do my very best. But in summary, pathways tend to differ in the extent to which they focus on the use of large-scale technology, particularly in relation to greenhouse gas removals, carbon capture, usage and storage, and hydrogen, or on greater levels of consumer engagement and behavioral change, leading to things like demand reduction of things like travel and material consumption, as well as greater electrification of end energy uses. These different approaches aren't mutually exclusive, not least because some sectors, like agriculture, for example, are particularly challenging to reduce emissions entirely. And so these residual emissions will need to be offset by greenhouse gas removals, which could themselves require carbon capture, usage and storage, regardless of the amount of behavioral change and demand reduction that occurs. But it is worth noting here, and this is sort of a broader point around what's known as the just transition, that at the extremes of the different pathways that are available, there are large differences in the changes that need to be made to daily lives. So there we're talking about changes to diet, travel, home heating, etc., as well as issues around the structure of the economy and a much wider range of systems. A key challenge here relates to the social equity considerations associated with the net zero transition. We're talking about things like the distribution of costs and the rights of those who are currently working in high carbon industries. And I'm very much of the view, as are many others, that the transition has to be fair and inclusive and leave nobody behind. And we need to ensure that developing economies receive the financing and also the technological know-how that they need to build out their energy systems and meet the needs of their expanding populations and their economies in a sustainable way. One thing I would say is that, without trying to cover all the bases here, we've got limited time. If you really did want to dig more into this area, I would highly recommend reading the International Energy Agency's Net Zero by 2050 report. It's a fantastic piece of research, and it sets out a comprehensive roadmap, including government actions to rapidly boost clean energy and reduce fossil fuel use. The other sort of study that I would have a look at, the other report I would consider, is the Climate Action Pathways report. And that was published by the UNFCCC High-Level Climate Champions and the Marrakesh Partnership. It's really instructive, and it sets out a highly comprehensive and granular set of roadmaps to achieving the Paris Agreement across a number of sectors.
Thank you so much again, Rebecca, for your explanation. I totally agree with your social equity consideration challenges that we have. It's very difficult to address and balance everything together. And also, I agree with your point on regional differences that we have, especially in the developing markets and emerging markets. For example, in India, we see a lot of emissions, like about, I would say, I think estimated emissions, about 90% are coming from these countries, So, and we need a lot of investments there. But the problem is, again, the credit ratings and the cost of capital is high in these countries. So, yeah, a lot of challenges there. So let's turn back our attention to the corporates. As audience also said, that a lot of work needs to be done by the corporates. They are the front runners. So I'll go back to Lynn, and would like to ask her about the major challenges that the companies may face to tackling net zero, and how can they overcome those challenges?
Well, as Rebecca has said, this is not going to be simple or easy. I'm going to put my environmental management system hat on. If it's a formally managed company, I would really strongly encourage large companies to make sure that they have an environmental management system in place. they can use the international standard ISO 14001. It sets out requirements as a framework. And the advantage of something like an international standard is it becomes a common language between organizations, so that when they're talking environmental aspects, which are the emissions and the generation of waste, it becomes a common language to communicate within companies, and it can foster, I think, an acceleration of action. If a company doesn't have a management system in place, then they're kind of doing a bits and pieces approach to addressing this issue. And that's not very efficient. Unfortunately, one of the things that we've known about in terms of organizations is ecological literacy, actually knowing what the rules by which the planet operates are not common. And research from the States and from the UK and other countries have kind of indicated that there's only maybe about 1 to 5% of any population anywhere, whether they're in business or in government or in citizens, only about 1 to 5% are actually ecologically literate. Everybody tends to be aware that we have issues. I mean, it's pretty clear when you have a tornado happening, or you have a heat wave, or you have a flood, that we have issues. And right now we have such, because of climate change, people think it's just that we get hotter, but it's not just that we get hotter. That's the trapping of these emissions into our atmosphere. But it's the fact that we will have more frequent violent shifts in weather. So one day you could have a heat wave, the next day you could have a hailstorm, and you could have a drop of 40 or 50 degrees, which might be more common in a desert when you have that adverse or that extreme hot and cold shift. But that's not something that would be common, for example, in Southern Ontario. I am a fan of an environmental management system as well, because it is a true systems approach, and it wants you to, first of all, plan what is it that you really have to do. Then it wants you to do that thing. It asks you to check to make sure whatever you plan to do and you did give you the results that you were looking for. And if there is a need to improve or to change, you change the system. You don't twiddle with the dials at the end of the rope. The other advantage to this is that it can enable more innovation to occur. One of the places that we send people to is in terms of what can you do today? And you've referred to some of these already in terms of plant-based diets. But if I could err on sharing my video again, one of the places that we send people is to something called Project Drawdown. Project Drawdown is about 10 or 12 years old now. It was started by a chap named Paul Hawken, who was an entrepreneur and he's a philanthropist. And what he wanted to do was figure out how can we help organizations address, it wasn't net zero when he first started out, it was climate change, but how do we address these issues? And they brought a team of researchers together from around the world, and they said, what technologies are available today that you can do? The reason it's called drawdown, though, is before we get to net zero, we have to have drawdown. We have to reduce the emission, excuse me, the levels of greenhouse gases, excuse me, in the atmosphere, because our bathtub is not balanced at this moment. Drawdown offers 80 different proven technologies. You can go on the website. They also have a learning program. So if you're not familiar with some of the nomenclature or some of the ideas around this, it can help you there. And it does speak to the need to have quick, safe, and equitable change occur. The other thing that I like, actually, from a simple tool is I like En-ROADS. And En-ROADS is it's a simulation program and was developed out of MIT. The person leading the project originally was John Sterman, who you can see on screen. Quite an interesting fellow. And what I like about En-ROADS is you can play with what they have in their program, and you can see the effect of a policy change on bringing the temperatures down. And I'm going to show you a screen. And the thing that's nice about this is A, it's free. B, it gives you results in 16 seconds. So this is just a screenshot of it, but you can see they have, where all these different sort of energy issues. Net zero was added not too long ago, but when you play with it, it will show you instantly where you decide. So you take those little black dots and all those different things, you can slide those back and forth, and it will give you an instant change on the right-hand side over here of the temperature drop that you can achieve. So you can say, well, I'm going to get rid of coal. How does that affect the temperature? I'm going to increase renewables. How does that bring the temperature down? So I really like that tool because it lets you test various scenarios. And the sooner we can get drawdown, the sooner we have a better chance of actually getting to net zero.
Okay, Lynn, I have a question. Can companies use En-ROADS for the individual setup, or it's like a global tool?
It's more of a bigger company testing situation, but the fact that it gives you such good information so quickly is of great value. Mm-hmm. Because you can sort of see, where am I going to go with this? If I decide as a company that we're not going to invest in coal, what is the impact of that?
Right.
It's the fact that it's so fast and it's free is good. But also, En-ROADS also offers a training program, again, for free. So we need to make sure that more people are online to understand what their individual impact is. I know we tend to talk in these circumstances, we talk about what I'll call the canopy of the business world. Mm-hmm. This is the big guys, and they're the ones who are being really looked at, first of all, for their carbon emissions or their greenhouse gas emissions. And we have to remember, too, that greenhouse gases aren't just carbon. They're methane, and they are the fluorinated carbons. And we can't ignore those other things. And one of the problems with methane is, even though we focus on carbon, methane can have a bigger impact if it starts to really release. And that's one of the concerns we have as we start to raise the temperature and we heat up the north and permafrost starts to melt. That's where the methane is going to come out. But it's not the only thing that's going to come out of the permafrost. Mm-hmm. We also know there'll be other fun things. For example, some kids I think it was in Siberia, came across a deer that had been preserved in ice. But when the ice melted and the deer was exposed, it also introduced anthrax, because that's what the deer had died of many years ago, like hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and it was trapped in the ice. So the gifts that the Mother Nature gives back to us when she's not happy are not just a single gift.
Thank you so much for this insightful information on Project Drawdown and En-ROADS. I'm sure the audience will be able to utilize and benefit out of that. I want to ask you an extended questions related to the corporates. So how should companies set out their principles and strategies for achieving net zero? And how should they define their roadmap for implementation? For example, key decision points, milestones, data, governance to ensure delivery.
I'm going to come back. I'm a fan of companies using a management system because it gives you consistency in terms of the framework, but it also gives you flexibility to set your own policies and procedures. One of the things it can allow you to do too, though, is let's say if I am a company by myself and I think I'm going to do, meet scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, but I'm going to do it by myself. But I've got to talk to my upstream and downstream people. or I've got to talk to 2 suppliers. If the value of what each one of us can do, it's a sum, because we're not working together. We're just talking to each other. So 3 companies, let's say their individual value is 9. Together, as a sum, the total value is 27. But if we start to integrate and come together, whether it's through things like an industrial ecology process, where we do a system of systems, we create a business ecosystem, then your value of 9 becomes 9 to the power of 9 to the power of 9, and the value of that chain is now 729. So much greater value. One of the things that the people that I worked with, back in 2013, when ISO was revising its standard, we brought 16 different business sectors together in Canada, and we said, how do we want to improve the standard? And what came out of this is we formed a group called the Collaboration. And the Collaboration decided that, first of all, after revising, being a part of the revision process for 14,001, they all wanted to know what value proposition they could continue to get from working together. And when the task force on climate-related financial disclosures came out in 2017, we looked at it as a group. And we said, well, we have an AMS. It allows us to have a consistent, structured approach to dealing with these issues based on a system. So how can we leverage the value proposition? And so what ended up happening was we developed a systems approach that we call Are You Climate Ready? And the idea was, how do we help from the individual to the corporation to the improvement process and the sharing of results? So Are You Climate Ready has 4 components to it. The first one really is about asking people in the corporation whether they feel they're climate ready, because people have to make decisions based on better knowledge. So we ask the individuals in the corporation whether they feel that they are ready for climate change. One of the reasons we do that is because we want to affect behavior change. And in the cognitive science world, that's called positive spillover. And we take that into the organization. One of the reasons we also want to do that is we know, based on the last 3 years of the reporting from the TCFD, that there are, overall, the reporting is actually quite weak. You're not really getting a report cards above 50%, but there are 4 strategic weaknesses, the biggest one being the resilience of strategy. And that's where it gets tied back as well to a net zero. If net zero is part of your strategy, and you really don't understand who you're playing, you're not going to be horribly successful. Risk management is another area where people don't seem to really understand it, although we all talk about big story. But the other weakness area is in the board oversight and management's role. And so we have to be able to help them. And ISO offers a set of 9 requirements for top management or the C-suite to help them go forward on that. So we have, individual action. We have tying the TCFD reporting to the management system. Then it's, now you know what you have today, how are you going to change to have a better tomorrow? And we look at tying ISO 14001s to the SDG targets. And then we tie that back to Project Drawdown. We look at other things as well, and En-ROADS is one of our things on the side that we encourage people to use. But people also have to remember that the SDG targets, 22 had a date of 2020. One has a date of 2025, that's 14.1 on water. 89 had no target dates. So you're only left with 59 targets for 2030. I can't say that we've done a great job of that so far. And so we need to keep pushing forward. And the last thing we do is the companies that subscribe to this, we collate the information, we look for patterns and trends, and then we collaborate either to find other solutions for them if they need more, or we end up creating more things out of this. So, and the other thing we do, which is to help with smaller organizations, because right now all this activity of net zero really is working in the canopy of the business world. It really isn't doing much. Like ISO, as much as they like to think, ISO really isn't being adopted by small business. And if I use Canadian statistics, we have about 1.2 million legally constituted employer businesses in Canada. 0.2% are the big companies. That's more than 500 people in a company. About 2% are medium-sized companies. 95% of business in Canada, and this applies to other countries around the world, are in companies with less than 50 people, and they aren't into formal management systems. So one of the things we did, because 80% of your environmental issues are location-based, we developed a mapping, well, we based it on a mapping process and we turned it into an app. So you can take a picture, you can figure out what your environmental issues are, you can decide how significant they are, and then you can map those things. So that's kind of the way we think that you need to have a systems approach, you need to collaborate, it's going to change how you operate with other companies, but that's the value of things like the Net Zero Alliance and other collaborative ventures.
Thank you. Very insightful. Yes. So collaboration and system approach, and the information present awareness and knowledge around the world. So Rebecca, of late we have seen how Shell responded on its net zero plans after the court ruling. Will regulations help in accelerating or reducing, according to your opinion, the campaign-style policies for achieving net zero targets? How are laws and regulations embedding and responding to the concepts regarding corporate sustainability and net zero?
Thanks, Nisha. Well, the body of hard law and regulation relating to sustainability is expanding at a very rapid rate across all regions and all sectors. So what we're seeing is principles that used to be enshrined in soft law are rapidly being transposed into hard law rules with teeth. One of the key issues here is that the impacts of climate change are not uniform across the world. We mentioned that earlier. So you've got states and regions dealing with different types of threats, and this has contributed to fragmentation in climate and environmental law. So we're seeing different approaches develop at different speeds in different regions. However, overall, there is a tightening of regulations pertaining to carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions. We're seeing a greater emphasis on transparency and disclosure through mandatory obligations, in particular relating to climate-related financial risk, its governance, its disclosure into the marketplace, etc. And this is a central theme for regulatory bodies across the globe. This initial focus of regulators on reporting and disclosure to facilitate capital flows into sustainable investments is now broadening out. So the latest high watermark is the imposition of active due diligence and risk management obligations across value chains in Europe. It's important to pause on Europe because the EU has really been at the forefront of regulatory change relating to sustainability. However, before I go into a little bit of detail around what's happening in the EU, we know that ESG-related law is contagious. So concepts that arise in one jurisdiction can easily influence policymakers in others. And of course, companies from outside the EU need to be aware of the regulatory context in the EU when they are investing there. So then thinking about what's happening in the EU, at a high level, there are broadly two key issues that the EU's ESG-focused regulations seek to address. The first is, how do you determine if an economic activity is environmentally sustainable in an objective way? And it's the EU's taxonomy regulation that seeks to deal with this by essentially developing a classification system for economic activities that substantially contribute towards a sustainable economy. And this regulation has very much evolved out of a need to overcome the lack of consistent benchmarking and common standards in the green investment market. One of the impacts of the taxonomy will be to increase the focus on corporates asset owners and asset managers providing certain forms of disclosures relating to the nature of their activities. And the idea here is really that if core activities can be assessed for their sustainability against objective metrics, then this will flow up to related disclosures at the issuer and portfolio level. And really, as I mentioned earlier, at the heart of this is the aim to facilitate the flow of capital towards environmentally friendly activities by helping investors make better informed decisions. We're seeing a number of other of similar frameworks being developed across the globe, so in places like Canada, Japan, and Malaysia. But as it stands, I think it's not controversial to say that the EU's taxonomy represents the most ambitious and detailed attempt to date at establishing a common language around sustainability. The second question that the EU's ESG-focused regulations seek to address is how do you ensure that there is some accountability for companies and financial institutions in relation to their activities? And there are various pieces of legislation aimed at disclosure and reporting requirements to address this. So you've got the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which will soon be replaced with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and that's focused on companies. You've got the disclosure regulation together with various changes to MiFID II, the UCITS Directive, and AIFMD, and that's focused on investors. The disclosure regulation, or SFDR, as some of you may refer to it, that regulation in particular really aims to drive the integration of sustainability risks into investment decision-making and risk management, as well as driving greater transparency on the sustainability of financial products marketed as sustainable, in order to really channel private investment towards sustainable investments while preventing greenwashing. So the wider expectation on the part of regulators in the EU is that by requiring asset owners and asset managers to provide detailed disclosures on the ESG credentials of their financial products and portfolios, the relevant regulations will increase capital flows to asset managers that have better ESG credentials. And in turn, that will then create a commercial driver to provide more and better ESG focused products to attract those capital flows. And this objective of directing capital flows towards sustainable economic activities really underpins this whole package of EU regulations focused on sustainability. The UK is taking a similar approach in this respect. So we have mandatory TCFD disclosure, and the goal is, that's for premium listed companies at the moment, the goal is that will be expanded out across the whole corporate value chain by 2025. Regulatory developments in Asia Pacific are also mainly intended to facilitate capital flows towards sustainable investing. They are at the moment less onerous than what we're seeing in the EU, but nonetheless have a similar objective. And I think it's very clear from what we're seeing in the US that with Biden in the White House, that we've got strong signals now of climate-focused disclosure regimes being introduced in the US, and the SEC in particular is widely expected to introduce climate-related disclosure requirements for publicly traded companies. One point worth mentioning is that compliance across all of these different regimes, even if they have the fundamental same goal, is very challenging for businesses, for investors, and for lenders, because there is huge scope for regulatory divergence across different regions, especially given the fundamental challenge that there is no single gold standard yet when it comes to sustainability, performance, and reporting. Obviously, we know that there are steps in that direction with IFRS and all of the different frameworks starting to converge and partner with one another, but it is still a major challenge, and particularly in the context of the growing disclosure and reporting burden that's facing companies and investors and lenders across the globe.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Again, very insightful. Taking your points that new regulations are being introduced all over the world, and gradually in the developing markets. Of course, Europe and UK has taken the lead. SEC is also going to come up with a regulation very soon. They've announced it that they need climate reporting regulations. But then the question is that how are the leaders and the board of directors of the company, how are they reacting to this? Are they committed to achieving, we have also read so many cases where, as I was mentioning, that they have adopted net zero targets for campaign style approach to get sustainability linked funds, etc. So do you think that there is a paradigm change happening at the C-suite level and the board of directors? As Lynn also mentioned and focused, that even ISO 14001, there's a whole clause that articulates the expectations of the top management, which includes both C-suite and the directors, right? So what is your opinion on that? Are they committed to achieving net zero?
It's a great question. Look, fundamentally, directors act as fiduciaries of the company in discharging their functions. And so what does that mean? What does that include? Well, that is really all about overseeing corporate performance, strategy, and risk management. It means ensuring robust legal compliance systems. It means approving significant transactions. And it means also improving and engaging with corporate reporting and disclosure. So broadly speaking, and of course, there are different regulatory frameworks around this in different countries, but broadly speaking, as fiduciaries, directors owe two core duties to the company. The first is the duty of loyalty, and the second is the duty of care and diligence. I mentioned that the precise nature of these duties vary by jurisdiction, and that is an important point. But generally speaking, in common law jurisdictions, directors' fiduciary duties are articulated in statutes and in case law and developed by courts over time. In civil law jurisdictions, those duties are set out in statute, and that will govern the conduct of directors. So while you've got this variation, the overarching concepts of loyalty and care in corporate governance tend to be widespread. In general terms, the duty of loyalty requires that directors act honestly and in good faith and in the best interests of the company. And that's typically defined in exclusively financial terms. The duty of care requires that directors exercise reasonable care and skill and diligence in the discharge of their own stewardship functions, including by taking reasonable precautions against reasonably foreseeable harms. Enter climate change. The standard of care that is demanded by company directors today in relation to climate change is massively increasing. And case law, as you've mentioned, Nisha, is indicating that sustainability factors now play a much bigger role in company decision-making. And company directors who consider climate change and wider ESG risks and actively disclose them properly and respond appropriately will inevitably reduce both their companies and their own personal exposure to potential liability. So in today's world, really to discharge their duties, directors must integrate climate risks and opportunities into their governance roles. For public companies, in most jurisdictions, there are existing obligations under national laws to assess, manage, and report on financially material climate risks. I mentioned earlier, the mandatory status of TCFD in the UK, for example. And while you've got jurisdictional variation, corporate reporting and more broadly, securities law frameworks generally require listed companies to disclose information that is materially relevant to their financial performance and prospects. And that now includes climate change. The other thing that it would be remiss of me not to mention, and you picked up on the Shell case, is that litigation and liability risks are real, both for directors personally and for the company. So the most recent indication obviously was the decision by the district court in The Hague, which ordered Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, to cut its emissions by 45% by the end of 2030 compared to 2019 levels. That decision is being appealed, but nevertheless, it is stark evidence, I think, of a shift in terms of companies' climate responsibilities. And what I expect we'll see is that governance mechanisms to mitigate the risks of climate change and even potentially personal liability ought to therefore be prioritized by forward-thinking boards in today's world.
Wow, thank you so much. Actually, this is my favorite area, so I can keep on going, keep on asking questions in this area. Let's take questions from the attendees, please. Okay, so the first question that we have here is to Lynn. Does an environmental management system address as only aspects related to my own organization's immediately actions, or does it address what my supply chain does?
The first thing you do is figure out what you have, but we do have provision in the standard to look at the life cycle of your product and service. And so, for example, if your company has a very defined area, but you have outsourced things which are defined by the scope of your environmental management system, then that will bring those things in. And there are two things about an EMS. I want to clarify one thing though, is because of the flexibility of an EMS, it doesn't always mean that the C-suite from a corporate perspective is always involved. Because if your EMS scope is on a facility, the top management of that facility is ones that are recognized. But coming back to the question is, people often look at the requirements in the standard as being kind of a box, as opposed to it's a framework. What suit you decide to hang on that framework is your choice. And when you know that things upstream can affect your environmental performance and your productivity, it only makes sense that you go at least have a conversation. While there is provision for that in the standard, it's sometimes a difficult thing to put into practice. For example, if I'm a really small business and my supplier is a mega company and they don't have any interest in talking to me about environmental issues, it's a very dangerous conversation. Even some companies that are quite large, but their supplier is bigger, it's a difficult conversation. But the more you can do by having a conversation with your supply chain, I think the better value you would get from it. It's how you do that and when you do that is important. But you need to understand that when you don't include something, that can have an impact on your organization. Human design systems aren't terribly efficient at this point in time. Research that's been done over the years that looked at material weight-based assessments basically said that human design systems are between 94 and 98% inefficient. That means if you flip it around, for every $100 you're investing, you might be getting $2 to $6 out of your investment. That's not horribly good. And when energy is the currency of productivity, I think you need to think of this as a broader opportunity. But that's also where innovation comes in. And as opposed to looking this as being just a risk management process, if I look, for example, at the field of biomimicry, which is the art and science of using nature's genius, nature's processes to create products and services, this is a burgeoning field. And by 2025, the estimate is it's going to be worth $300 billion around the world. And by 2030, it'll be worth $425 billion. Well, if you can redesign your management system to make changes to your products and services that take advantage of things like biomimicry, you could be positioning yourself as the company of choice to buy from. And that would be a pretty good thing.
Thank you, Lynn. There's another question for you. They're asking that does this environmental management system can work for pension fund, asset manager, private equity, and so on? So does this, is it relevant for the financial institutions as well?
Oh, well, in Canada, there is a financial institution that 10 years ago adopted 14,001 for its real estate. They are expanding that now. Basically, if you breathe, you have an environmental impact potential, and you should be looking at this. And that's where the flexibility of using the standard as a framework comes into value. One of the other values, though, for a pension fund is that what are you investing in? And if they don't have an environmental management system that you can really look at, maybe you should really be thinking about whether or not necessarily pulling your money out yet, but go to them and say, how do you prove to me that you understand and you are doing the best job possible so that my investment in you doesn't become a stranded asset? That's one of also the problems with carbon offsets. There's a whole discussion about whether they're really as good as they say they are. And if you're investing into the rebuilding of a forest area, and because of climate change, it goes up in smoke, is that a stranded asset, or is that an asset that's just gone up in smoke? So the opportunity for a pension fund is your own operations may not have huge impacts, but the power of your investment can have profound implications in the supply chain or value chain.
Yeah, so I would like to add to that that even the pension fund or the financial institutions, they have to track and monitor their investee companies as well, right? Yeah. So yeah, actually, in our platform, we are providing that tracking and monitoring for the financial institutions. And that will be very useful, I think. Okay, so there's a next question for Rebecca. Do regulators and supervisors have the technical capacities to implement and enforce the EU plans? If no, what types of capacity, skills, and expertise would they require?
It's a really tough question. I think the truth is that to get this right, there are going to need to be partnerships and collaborations across a very wide group of people. And to be fair to the EU, that is the approach that they have taken in setting up various task force and groups, a technical expert working group, bringing different people from different sectors together to tackle this very much multifaceted challenge. So the regulators on their own, no, but in partnership with others, I think it is workable. And look, if you look at the development of the taxonomy, aspects of it are controversial. Not everybody is agreed with the approach that's been taken. It is extremely ambitious in what it sets out to achieve, but it is not perfect by any means. So do I think that the regulator, there is one regulator we can look at in the world that has really got this right yet? No, but I think the only way that we're going to come close is through the partnership and collaboration model that we have seen in the EU.
Thank you so much. Lynn, I think this question is for you. How is the current monitoring done for carbon emissions or other kind of emissions? Now, is it based on mathematical computation or there are physical sensors used?
I think that there are various methods for tracking. I know that there has been discussion about the use of satellites. There has been, and some of them are micro satellites. They're not the huge things we're used to. But I also know there's a big push for other AI activity in this area. People tend to have different equations that they use. There really isn't complete consistency in the world. I know that, there's the GHG protocol, which is the one that tends to be the go-to, even though ISO has its own. But a lot of the measurement processes that we have are still pretty, I'll use the word gross or large focused things, but getting down to the ground for a small business may not be as accurate. There are, all attempts to bring forward different kinds of calculators now, but then how do you verify for a small business who's got 15 minutes a week to do something like this, how do you make the verification process for them practical? But I think there won't be one methodology. I don't think there'll be one option. I think there has to be a number of them because it might be regionally dependent. It also might, because I mean, in developing countries, do you have the technology to buy for some of these things? And probably not. But the other thing I want to just kind of tag on this too is, we are very focused on in the governance toolkit regulation, but there are other things I think we have to be cognizant in the governance toolbox. For example, in Canada and in the EU, and Rebecca's right, the EU is being very aggressive in this area. But for example, in Canada, if you have a regulation, but you continue to subsidize the problem companies, that kind of disqualifies the benefit of what you're trying to get. And, we tend to look at the fact that we do have 12 different kinds of governance activities that we could apply. Regulation alone is not the only tool that we should be looking at. We should be looking at removing subsidies. Do we need to have user fees? We need to have far better education and information use. So there's a whole range of things that I think we have to consider in this area.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's one question regarding ESG. So a lot of reporting standards used by companies are very lengthy reports and there is no rating involved there. And if we as an insurance fund or insurance or a fund manager want to decide where to invest and what's the best way to compare apples with oranges, I know it's a big topic again. Okay, one quick answer I have. This topic was discussed in the last webinar, the entire 1.5 hour discussion we had on this particular thing. So Rebecca, if you want to add something on this, I know it's not easy.
There was another question, I think, earlier, which was asking for my view on whether we need a unified structure. And I think I gave away my view on this in my response to one of the previous questions, but it's really difficult. What I would say is that we have actually been here before in relation to financial accounting. So it took a really long time to come up with the globally accepted standards that we have around financial accounting. And I think it won't take as long because there is such a push and pressure on getting this right for ESG. I think we will see that unified structure and a globally accepted standard emerge within the next 3 years. But as it stands, there are a dizzying array of voluntary and aspirational frameworks that have developed in recent years. And those are all trying in their own way to establish best practice and norms in relation to measuring ESG impacts and embedding those factors in risk assessment and decision making. I mentioned some of those frameworks have traditionally been opt-in, some are now being mandated through hard law like TCFD. There are a number of initiatives out there trying to streamline the growing number of frameworks. So I mentioned the recent announcements from the IFRS Foundation regarding its intention to develop a global set of sustainability standards. And part of this is going to entail the establishment of a new Sustainability Standards Board. And that approach has received widespread endorsement from supervisors, regulators, corporates, investors, and lenders across the globe. You've got other exciting developments, such as the recent announcement from the Global Reporting Initiative and the Impact Measurement Network B-Lab regarding their new collaboration. But for now, there isn't a common standard, and this landscape of frameworks and acronyms, quite frankly, can be very tricky to navigate. I think, if I was going to point to one framework that's really becoming the gold standard, I would say in relation to climate-related financial risk, it is TCFD. And in that respect, you've got really good implementation guidance and good practice guides that are being published. And that's helpful because it shows you real practical examples of how businesses are integrating ESG into governance, strategy, and risk management. It also shows you good practice in how to report on those actions. So it's win-win. but it is a major challenge. I do believe we'll get there. I'd love to know what Lynn thinks about this.
That's why we actually created Are You Climate Ready? Because I know that, and I've been involved in a lot of sort of backroom discussions lately. BSI, the British Standards Institute, had a webinar about, I think it was a week and a half ago, but don't quote me on that. And they had a presentation by the gentleman who is involved in the G20. And they basically said, look, there are 200 taxonomies around the world. We want one. We need to have credit rating companies on the same page. We need to make sure that anybody who says they have ESG is not greenwashing, because the slippery slope of greenwashing is, greenwashing, we've defined that in our one standard by saying it's either ignorance or inadvertent, and inadvertent is a polite way of saying you did this on purpose. But whether you greenwash because you don't, in theory, know any better or not, when does that shift into becoming fraud, eco-fraud, and when does that push into the extreme and when it becomes ecocide? And there are, I think, 27 different countries now that have ecocide laws. And we do see the longer it takes for the global corporate community to get themselves organized on this, and I would strongly recommend that you don't wait for these things to come forward, that you spend the time and effort today to figure out what it is that you have or do that causes these emissions to occur. What can you do? Who can you work with to get them down? People forget there is a time delay to these issues. And, I put out on LinkedIn the other day is, what do people think about, for example, the time value of sequestration? Because if you don't do something today, it's going to take time before whatever your action is taken gets the results that you're looking for. So, when people talk about 2050 or 2030, like with the SDGs, which are, there are things that all have to be connected to this discussion. In order to say that we meet 2030, we have really 7.5 years. Why? Because we have to have the time to demonstrate the fact that we accomplished those things. And if we didn't accomplish those things, we need time to fix it. So there's that delay factor again, because Mother Nature doesn't respond like this to the things that we think should happen. She operates on an entirely different currency than we do. And you cannot buy your way into heaven, by trying to renegotiate a deal, because there is no refinancing ecological debt.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I agree. We used to say this common quote, charity starts at home. So you have to first think as an individual, how can you contribute towards sustainability? And as an individual, if you have a mindset, you can take it to your office and, inspire others and implement it in your strategies. So, something like this we are doing as in a small endeavor from our side. We're building this platform where we are encouraging companies to rethink their mission and vision and strategies, and then monitor those strategies on our platform to track, as Rebecca and Lynn, you were talking about, how can investee companies be monitored and tracked. So this part, this platform will be able to achieve or to track and monitor the goals, even the net zero ones. So let's say the company has put on, accepted the targets, committed to the targets, and then what are their short-term goals, how are they achieving it, and then engaging with the stakeholders from time to time, publishing it to the platform and letting them know that, yes, we are on the right track. So currently we are seeing that there is a mismatch between the share value and the ratings that they get from the sustainability ratings agencies. I don't want to name them, but yes, there is a lot of mismatch, and inconsistencies. So we cannot rely on that. And of course, the sustainability reports are very long, and some companies, they do it on GRI, some companies they follow SASB, now called Value Reporting Foundation, and TCFG. So it's very difficult to compare. And what we need is, I was talking with one of the very influential person in Japan. He's into corporate governance as well, and he and I, we both agreed that we need to have a database which is online, and which is what do you say, it's consistent and aligned with all the frameworks. So even we don't have to wait for IFRS to come and tell us that this is how you have to do it. We can do it ourselves. We have to just take the indicators and then follow up. So what I mean by indicators is like mapping and aligning, of course, of all the frameworks. We don't have to worry about the reporting initiative or value reporting foundation. Just do whatever you can do and make commitments to yourself and showcase to the world. Yeah.
Just to jump in there, I couldn't agree more. And one final very short point on that is that, I would encourage you as a fund manager to engage with the companies that you're investing in, and encourage them to report in a way that provides you with decision useful information. Investors really can use their voice to help ensure that companies are performing better around sustainability and are providing information in a way that is useful to you.
Thank you. I would invite.
Sorry, can I just build on that too?
Yes.
Reporting is very important to enable the investment world and others to understand where you are. But if you're not doing today, your report is a piece of paper, it's a use of carbon, of electrons, and quite frankly, it's not going to give the value we need. Which is why when in our initiative, which ties in very nicely with what you're doing, Nisha, is we're focusing on the doing. You share the information based on the doing so that we understand what are the patterns and trends where there are strengths and weaknesses. What other innovations do we need to help you find or implement? Because if you're not doing today, your report will always look bad. And that's not the way forward, because there is no silver bullet. There's no one thing you can do. Everybody has to make changes. We have to reduce our consumption. We have to optimize the way our businesses operate. Inside, we have to create business ecosystems so that whoever can lead first, fastest can go. Because if we don't do this, we will not achieve what we desperately need to have, which is a safe operating space for everybody.
Thank you so much. You summed it up so well. I was going to do it, but then thank you so much, Lynn, and thanks, Rebecca, for being here, present here, and providing your insightful knowledge and discussion on various points. We discussed about corporate governance, we discussed about GHG scope, we talked about carbon neutrality, we talked about various frameworks, and ISO, Are You Climate Ready system. I hope that will be very useful for all the corporates, and good luck with that, Lim. So excellent discussion. Thank you so much, and have a good day, Rebecca, and both of you. In fact, you have day left. For us, it's night. It's 10:30 right now. But all the best, and let's stay in touch. Thank you so much, audience, for attending the webinar today. Thank you for asking your questions, very insightful, and please stay in touch with our email address, which was actually the email that you received from the registration, Zoom registration. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night, have a good evening, good afternoon to you. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.